Okay.
Hmm. I think
Welcome
now
and Shubo Bijoy Divosh. This is Zafar Sobhan, editor of Counterpoint. I'm joined today by Counterpoint's executive editor, Jyoti Rahman, who's also well known, is a writer, commentator, and historian. And I think here, what we are talking about today is we wanted to have a conversation surrounding Jyoti's book or his article, Ekatture Ei Boiguli. And why don't you tell us a little bit about the article you wrote, and then that'll be how we start the discussion.
sure. Well, look. Firstly, I don't think anybody has ever called me a historian before. Okay, so let's not call
Amateur historian, but no, I mean, if you're
amateur
not a
history.
historian, who is? Huh? You tell me.
Somebody who reads history books. Let's put it that way. In
This whole
Bangladesh, there is
article is about history books. Damn it!
it is about history books. It's true. This is true. It is a literature review, if you could put it that way. Okay.
Yeah,
In Bangladesh we have this thing. By the way, this is a conversation, right? So this is not a
yeah.
podcast. This
No,
is
absolutely.
this is what you have with John, and this is what you have with Professor Sobhan. It's the same thing, right? That's like
Absolutely. Yeah,
we
and
are
we're trying to really create this culture here at Counterpoint. We call this feature Counterpoint Conversations. And I think that's really what I want to do. I think there's a lot of weighty discussions. এগুলো কোনো অভাব নাই বাংলাদেশে. You have your talk show, the talk show circuit, the talk show ecosystem. And what I'm trying to create here, what we're trying to create here, is conversations rather than talk show katha, if that makes sense. Carry on. Yeah.
absolutely. Absolutely. And that's also why we try to do these things unscripted. We are experimenting with going live. There may be technological hiccups. Apologies upfront about that, because we're learning as we go. Okay.
Absolutely.
Right. So okay. So his sort of this article. So this article is something that I actually wrote back during COVID, during the lockdowns. Okay. And I wrote it in 2021
Yeah.
to mark the 50th anniversary of freedom. Okay. And so the backstory, if you go back, way back, Zafar, when we were younger and both of us had hair, and we used to do this blog in
Yeah.
Drishtipat long time ago, right?
That's right. Yeah.
So
That's
back
a long time
then,
ago.
yeah. So back then we used to sort of our old pal Naeem Muhammad. I'm hoping he saw the photo card, so I'm hoping he's dialed in at some point to watch us. He used to lament that, okay, look, sort of back then he used to lament that there aren't really that many good books on liberation war, and his definition of good books were that proper history book that you would maybe sort of read or study in a academic setting in a Western university. Okay, we have a
Yeah.
lot of books. We have a lot of books. A lot of those books are genuinely good books in the sense that sort of they make you think, they make you sort of ponder. They're poignant, weighty fictions and non-fictions in Bangla, but none of them are like or very few of them are that kind of solid history. Those
Okay.
big fat books. So this
Yeah.
is what
Sure.
Naim used to lament back then. Whereas by the time I actually started writing this article during the log in 2021, there were actually a number of books that had come out, right, over those many, sort of in the intervening years. So I thought
Yeah.
that, okay, sort of, and this is also when Bangladesh was under a regime where a lot of these things you couldn't really probably talk about publicly, because there were certain things around 1971 that you couldn't talk about. So, for example,
Right.
uh,
Well, I think this is it. I mean, it seems most of the books we're talking, certainly if we're talking about the ones which are published in English, and it's almost all of them really have been written by non-Bangladeshis.
that's right. Yeah, and they, because they were not subject to the Awami League regime's sort of very straight jacket way of looking at things. They could look at things a lot more freely, and they wrote about it. And then I thought that, okay, sort of I don't live in Bangladesh, and therefore sort of I'm not sort of constrained by those laws, right? Those
Yeah.
sort of the regime's straitjacket. So why I'm going to write about these books because I've read them, and what did they make me think? What did I learn, or what did I not know, or questions that I wished sort of these books answered or explored. And so I wrote that, and then a sanitized version of that came out in Dhaka Tribune.
So I
Um,
don't remember that it was. So what did we? Did we expunge? What did we expurgate from the original version? I can't recall. This was a few years ago, but
this was a few years ago. So the particularly about Sheikh Mujibur Rahman, right? That's
okay.
like his, and that is actually like sort of there is a beat here that actually goes fairly sort of deep into that, because as you know that there is sort of there's the Awami version of or
So,
Hasina's
wait up. So
version
when
of
we
this.
published it in Tribune, we took that piece out, huh? I can't. I don't recall that
Oh, I
because
think like
reading
yeah.
it now, I feel that I think that it's something which I would stand behind. There is criticism, no doubt, but I think it's very fair. It's very fair to Mujib, and it's a very praising as well. I mean, I think it's an even-handed discussion of the role he plays.
Well, ironically, now probably the argument would go the other way around. That, oh, look,
Right.
you're praising Sheikh Mujib too much. Don't you know that he was a coward who ran away and he was a villain and all of those things? Whereas I actually argue that,
True.
hang on, like this is actually a lot more complicated than that. But
Yeah.
yeah, so I mean, sort of, I don't actually remember exactly, how the editing went. But like I told you that, look, Zafar, I know that if there are constraints, and like I'm not in the business of becoming a shahid. You are not in the business
Yeah.
of becoming a shahid. Yeah, like do
Yeah.
whatever you need to do to make this happen. I think the other
Yeah.
issue was that the actual article is way too big, right? Like
Yeah, that's also probably
this
true,
box in probably at 5,000 words, and
Yeah.
even as a long form in a daily newspaper, I don't think you could have done
Yeah.
that, right?
Yeah.
So
I mean,
yeah,
I think we would wanted to bring it into sort of a two-page broadsheet, which I think is what we did with that. And so a
yeah,
lot of that probably had to do with cutting it down to a manageable size. Yeah.
yeah, absolutely. So yeah, so like sort of, so that's the backstory, right? But then
Yeah.
like I thought that, okay, now we have Counterpoint, and we want to talk about things, conversation, and today being the first national day since we started Counterpoint. I don't think we had it back in 26 March, 26th March.
We did not.
We did
We did
not.
not.
So
Yeah.
there you go.
Counterpoint started in May. In
In May.
fact. Yeah.
That's right. So then, yeah, like the first victory day since we started Counterpoint is as good a time to talk about these books as any.
No, and what I would like to talk about, and is getting back to your idea, is that, I think it has not been possible for many years and for many reasons. And I would actually say it's not just the last 15 years of Awami League rule, but for whatever reason, because we've had 71 has been so politicized and so weaponized on all sides, it's been very impossible to have a real nuanced discussion about it, and that could actually explain the paucity of Bangladeshi historians addressing it, not just in the last 15 years, but in the last 52 years. And as you point out, even today, because of the political moment we're in, we're not having a nuanced discussion on a national level
Right.
about 1971 either. It's just been flipped. It's sort of a 180-degree flip. Maybe after the elections in February, what will happen is a space will be created for a nuanced discussion. In fact, this is actually a subject which has been written about fairly extensively. We have published about a half dozen pieces from various authors in Counterpoint, and that's one of the things we are trying to do. And I'm really hopeful that, when we talk about Bangladesh 2.0, what does that actually mean? One of the things I hope that it means, I mean, it's obvious now that it doesn't mean a lot of the things people perhaps thought it was going to mean a year ago. But what I'm hopeful that it will mean is that we can start having these conversations at least.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And sort of the you were right that even before Awami League actually formally made sort of that you cannot talk about certain things about 1971. Even before that, even before that kind of legal injunctions that sort of 1971 was already heavily weaponized, and like speaking of Mujib, so one of the things that I wrote in that article is that okay? So just going backtrack a bit. So there were three books that I discussed in detail. So there was the um, Gary Bass's book, which was The Black Telegram. So
Yeah.
Nixon, Kissinger, and a Forgotten Genocide. So that came out in 2013. Then also in 2013, Srinath Raghavan's 1971, A Global History of the Creation of Bangladesh, that came out. And then in 2014, Salil Tripathi, who is a, by the way, we should also get him to write for Counterpoint. Just a thought.
I spoke with him on the phone 2 nights ago. So
yeah, there you go.
Yeah,
okay.
please.
Yeah.
Hopefully that will work out. Yeah.
So he wrote a book called The Colonel Who Would Not Repent, The Bangladesh War and Its Unquiet Legacy. So those were the three books that formed the basis of my essay, or those are the three books that I reviewed at length. And one of the things that struck me was that even though they explored at length, of course, the war and its backdrop and all of those things, and they asked they analyzed how the war erupted, how the political stalemate after the 1970 election eventually led to the war and all of that. They did not explore what is the political minefield question, or the political football question in Bangladesh, which is that, well, they didn't do many things, and I covered all of them. But the one that we're starting with is basically they did not get into why Sheikh Mujib did what he did. Why did he allow himself to be arrested on the 25th March, and without preparing the party for a long drawn war, this
I mean, it's not even so much that they don't really get into it, as you say, they don't really start to get into it. I think a more recent work of history which you may have read is Nurul Kabir's book,
right,
where he talks about that at quite length. But interesting about Kabir's book, Kabir Bhai's book, is that he lays it out there. It's a very good sort of work of history, and he offers various theories without himself coming to any assessment, which I think is the smart way of doing it. He lets the reader make up their own mind. But I think he really brings that issue front and center, no question, which is not mentioned.
Which is not mentioned in this article, because it
was written before he wrote that book.
That's right. So if I were to update this with something else, then we should definitely include Kabir Bhai's book. Absolutely.
Yeah.
So sort of Mujib's role was not one that these guys get into at length, even though that has strong political resonance in Bangladesh. And just for our listeners, so the argument that I put through in the essay is that clearly the Awami League line that Mujib was the sole player in 1971, the sole hero. I'm clearly that is not tenable, right? So that is that is political bunkum. But the counter line, which is that Mujib was a coward who ran away, or that he was a greedy politician who only wanted to become the prime minister of Pakistan and nothing else, that also doesn't hold water.
Right? Sure, no, that doesn't really fly. Yeah.
Right, because we know that Pakistanis had actually offered him the prime ministership, as in the office of prime minister. That was offered to him. That was offered to him by Ayub Khan even before the election in 1970. So Ayub Khan offered it to him back in 1969.
And you point this out in your article that probably in any case a Pakistan governed under the 6 points was not really a Pakistan much worth governing. In his entire political career, he didn't in any case been in the East. You see,
that's right.
Probably the last politician, possibly the only politician Pakistan ever had who united East and West was his mentor, Hussain Shahid Sarwardi. But since then, there had been no similar figure, and certainly not Mujib himself.
Certainly not Mujib himself. So interesting. So there is an interesting quip about Sohrawardi that he used to make for himself, and there was a
Yeah,
quip by Sohrawardi
yeah,
that went something like this: that okay, only three things unite Pakistan:
yeah.
um, the English language, PIA, and me,
And
as in him,
myself.
as in
Yeah,
Sohrawardi,
that's right.
myself, right?
Absolutely. I've
So
heard
yeah,
that one. Yeah.
yeah. So yeah, like sort of. So Sheikh Mujib had no constituency in West Pakistan. His political platform, 6 points,
And what's very
basically.
interesting, I just had this conversation with my father just yesterday on our Counterpoint Generations. It's interesting to me that, of course, the big political movement in West Pakistan was the People's Party, which had been founded just a few years back. And this Bhutto was this titanic figure in West Pakistan, but
Right.
he didn't bother building a party in East Pakistan at all. And
At
the
all,
People's
exactly.
Party had no candidates in the 1970 election
That's right.
here.
Yeah. So sort of. So Pakistan, as it existed, was as good as dead, given the
Yeah,
election result, right? So
yeah,
the idea that like sort of Mujib was negotiating to become the prime minister of a united Pakistan, and that's what he wanted, and he was greedy for that position. That doesn't really make sense either, right? And
yeah.
this is not even getting into the fact that when Mujib had power, he showed dictatorial tendencies and all of those things. I mean,
Mm.
even if we take a very negative view of him, that he was always a despot in making. Well, which
Hmm.
despot wants to become somebody else's puppet,
Sure.
right? So yeah. So I mean, like sort of. Okay. So given that, I think it still is a big historical question or puzzle, something
Yeah.
for
So
historians to.
the theory
Yeah.
you put forth in your article is that he, looking at the history of what happened in 1954, in 1958, and indeed in 1969, your theory is that would have assumed, or he was banking on, that that the non-cooperation movement would in fact lead to a negotiated settlement. That
That's right. Yeah.
underestimated the brutality of the Pakistani state and the Pakistani army. He did not anticipate the Operation Searchlight. He did not anticipate the extent of the carnage which would be unleashed.
Indeed, that is the conjecture. As a amateur reader of history books, I put forward
Yeah,
for serious historians to explore. And yeah, basically that he would have seen that in the 50s and 60s, every political upheaval in the East and sometimes in the West as well resulted in a regime change in Islamabad or Rawalpindi,
yeah,
right? And a new general would come in, and the new general would renegotiate terms, right? So
yeah,
in the 50s, this was basically that they could just dismiss a East Bengali government, Fazlul Haq government, as a with a decree,
yeah. With the
but
wave of the hand. Yeah,
with a wave of the hand. Whereas in the 50s, in the 60s,
58.
they had to 58. Ayub Khan had to annul the constitution and declare martial law. And
Yeah,
even declaring martial law was not enough for Yahya Khan. He had to concede election. So
yes.
Mujib might have figured that okay, I would be arrested. There would be curfew, and then another general would come forward, and that general would negotiate with me, and then
And
I would.
you have theorized that perhaps someone like Yaqub Khan could have been the type of
Indeed.
person, had power devolved to him, or someone like him, which would certainly not have been beyond the realms of possibility, that he would have been much more, from his public statements and how he has conducted himself at the time, he would be someone who would be willing to go for a negotiated settlement of this issue.
Yes, because and the that is right. That is my conjecture, and the reason for that is that we know from these books that have been reviewed, but also other books, memoirs by Pakistani generals, and so on, that the blueprint for Operation Searchlight was actually drawn up by him. So he was
Yeah,
a hawk, and then
yeah,
he came to Bangladesh and East Pakistan. He came to Dhaka. He saw
yeah,
the ground reality, and he said, "Okay, no, this plan is not going to work." Right?
yeah.
He drew it up, and then he basically said, "It's not going to work. We have to have political settlement." cantonment. So he was the
Yeah.
governor of East Pakistan for a short while, and then he flew back to West. And he was a lieutenant general. He sort of eventually would go on to become foreign minister under Zia-ul Haq during the Afghan wars. All right.
Yeah.
So sort of he was clearly a general who understood the global geopolitical dimensions fairly well. He had
Yeah.
a reputation for being a scholarly type. Sort of so sort of a future historian could actually explore his writings and his archives or his
Well,
diaries.
of course, and we don't even have to sort of what's the word, theorize, some kind of alternative reality where he becomes the chief of staff of the Pakistan Army and the chief martial law administrator. Things may have been, of course, very different had he in fact remained
That's right.
in command of the East and
That's
said,
right.
okay, well, I'll do this, but I will, presumably under his command, the war would have been conducted in a far more humane and far less
Or in that,
genocidal manner.
it would not be a war. In that, he
In
would
that
not go
sense,
in
yeah.
and shell Dhaka University and kill thousands of people in the old town,
Yeah.
and which then triggered all the mutinies across the cantonment among the Bengali soldiers. Zia Rahman and Shafiullah and all the other ones.
Now, of course, one of the theories going back to Bangabandhu's why he did what he did was that it was important because, of course, people in the army had been coming to him throughout March 1971. And and people were saying, why don't you declare independence? There was a lot of people thinking that that's what he was going to do on March 7th. In fact, he was under a lot of pressure from his student wing to, in fact, declare independence on that day. Whereas I think, diplomatically speaking, and this is an interesting sort of wrinkle. Diplomatically speaking, it made a huge difference for Bangladesh during those 9 months to be able to say that, look, we didn't start this. We didn't bring this war upon us. We are not secessionists.
Right.
Okay. It wasn't
right.
We didn't leave Pakistan. Pakistan left us. We are defending ourselves from a genocidal war, which was started by the Pakistan army on the night of the 25th of March. And this had a huge impact on, because one of the things, again, you talk about is that, if you look at, like, say, the Biafran War, for instance, which has, happened just a year before, if I'm not wrong, that, it was not, the fact that we actually prevailed in this movement was neither was it inevitable, nor was it something which there had been much precedent for, if any.
If any, that's right. I mean, at that stage, so Bangladesh was the first state that changed. Sort of basically, we were the first ones where a existing state broke up. So this happened later with the Yugoslavia and Soviet Union. But in 1971, we were the first one. So, sort of after World War II, basically global powers decided that, okay, the map of the world is what it is, right?
Yeah.
So, sort of the white man's empire finishes, we draw the border, we draw the lines on the map, and that's it. Nobody changes anything because changing these things cause a lot of trouble, right?
Yeah.
And then everybody everywhere accepted that. So, sort of we were the first ones to actually break that mold. Now, here is the other thing that I talked, sort of a bit in this article, but then I expanded on this in the piece that I wrote for Counterpoint in our first edition, which was about the role of the 1975 and all of that. Basically, that the Guns of November, this what happened in 71. So one thing was that Mujib could not have anticipated was obviously the brutality of Pakistan.
Yeah.
And if independence had to be declared, it was better that they start the war so that sort of we are not seen as the spoilers.
But it's secessionists. You see, that's the point, because of course that was, in all of the debates which were going on in the UN, they were saying, this is an internal matter. These are, and the UN would typically, take a position on secession in favor of the sovereign government. You see, so there had to be this had to be something which differentiated ourselves from that.
from that, exactly. But the other thing here is that I conjecture that how comfortable would Mujib had been with whole bunch of young majors and captains and colonels, playing a revolutionary role in any war of independence. So if you see it from
Sure.
Mujib's perspective in 19 before 25th of March 71, right?
Yeah.
So he had spent the previous 20 years fighting Pakistani, generals, army
Yeah.
people, right?
On a yeah.
On a politically, right?
Yeah.
And he would have known that, okay, if there is a war, Awami League is not going to lead the actual, the
Fighting.
Awami fighting, right? Awami League is not they don't have a Viet Cong. They didn't have a Viet Cong, right?
Sure.
So it would be either the left, and Mujib was not leftist by any means. In fact, he used to be accused of being, in Bangladesh, everyone is a CIA dalal, but, people used to call Awami League that, you are the rightist, the lackeys of imperialists and so on, right? So Mujib would have been worried about the left, but he would also have been worried about people in the army, right? That and he would have seen that what happens in other countries where these uniformed men who lead wars, they become national liberators, and then they would want a stake, in power. And this is probably something that Mujib would have been, if nothing else, he would have been wary of, right? So and that's something that so this was also the point that I tried to make about Tripathi's book, that the colonel who would not repent. From the title, the colonel here is Colonel Farooq Rahman, who killed or who led the 15th August massacre, right? So I thought that the book would actually delve into the kind of point that I made in my other essay about the role of Bangladesh Army,
Yeah.
and the fissures within the army about, on the one hand, the role that they would want to play as national liberators and and therefore assume power, versus the role that they had time and again played as giving up power and going back to the cantonment, leaving things to politicians, right? Now,
Yeah.
yeah, Salil Tripathi did not get into that dimension, but I wish somebody would.
No, that's true, and it is no, it is interesting. It is interesting because, of course, when you see so much of the history of Bangladesh post 1971 is actually born out of the liberation war. So, for instance, the 1970s were this incredibly unstable time with coup after coup, a lot of which has not really been registered in the historical record, and there's very little written about this. One of the people who I know is writing a book, and I hope he's going to get back to it post February, is Shafiqul Alam, who's of course the current press secretary of the interim government, Professor Yunus, but is known to us in the journalistic world as a long time a journalist here in Bangladesh. And so he's writing a book which is tentatively titled "When We Were Revolutionaries," talking about the 1970s. And from 75 to 80, and because it's an incredible time period when you think about it, and not so much has been written. Naeem Mohaiman did a very good movie
About 1977, the Air Force
about
mutiny.
77, and the coup in the Air Force.
Yeah.
But there have been many more which have really not received much scrutiny. And then, of course, it was really only after 1982, when Irshad came to power, that he really managed to break the power of the Mukti Juddhas in the army, largely by hanging most of them, to be perfectly blunt. The pinning Zia's assassination on them, and then hanging them, and then essentially regularizing the army and actually turning it in to a normal army, which is what we have now, rather than this proto-revolutionary outfit, which it was during the 1970s. And of course, it's understandable if you have fought and given blood for independence. It's likely that you're going to think that you should have a bigger role to play in the country which you fought to liberate.
Yeah, and also that, if you had mutinied once in the name of defending your people, in the name of the nation, right? And they've killed your your bosses, your commanders, which is what basically what Ziaur Rahman did in on 26th of March, but that he went on radio, made his iconic announcement,
Yeah.
arrested and killed his commander, right? So once you have done that for the nation, then somebody else says that, well, Zia did that, and I also want to go on radio, announce my revolution, and if and for that, if I need to kill my commander or my president, well, so be
Yeah.
it, right? And
Yeah.
so actually, the Raghavan has a very nice sentence that I'm going to read out now. That
Yeah.
the prolonged liberation war also created the cauldron in which the witch's brew of post-independence politics came to a boil. I mean, sort of that's a vivid imagery, right? The witch's brew and all of that. But that's exactly what the politics in 1970s was, right? That
Hmm.
there were coups and counter coups in the cantonment, two presidents being killed, but also that the we talk about political violence now, and the other day you did the show with John about 21st Man Hadi being
Yeah.
assassination attempt on this, but also
Hmm.
the sort of our politics had been incredibly violent since the day one because of the war, right? That politics was not this violent before the war because sort of the war, yeah, like or put differently, that like war had that effect. Wars tend to have that effect, and so if Mujib wanted to avoid a war at any cost, I think that like sort of I think we should recognize that this was sort of worth delaying a declaration of independence till the
Yeah.
last minute if you could avoid a war. All right, so
Yeah.
yeah,
No, I mean, I think that's right. I mean, I think that's right. Like declaring a war is a big deal. So anything you can do to have, now you could say that that was naive. The counter argument would be that, look, there was never going to be any negotiated settlement. It was,
sure.
and it's very interesting. I've seen some of the footage of this. Ramesh Sharma has made a movie on 1971 and 75, which I've seen clips of. And one of the things is that watching these guys get off the plane all throughout March. And these, there are all these
Right.
these guys wearing salwar kameez, pretending to be civilians, and they're
Yes.
sort of these tall, obviously soldiers.
Yes.
You know,
And like people kept coming to Mujib saying that, look, things are happening and so
yeah,
on. I mean, like sort of, so people like Ziaur Rahman or Khalid Musharraf and so on, like sort of they were
yeah,
they
Shafiullah as
were
well. I mean,
sensing things.
we forget his role here as well. But yeah,
That's right. Yeah.
yeah,
Okay. So now that was the other thing then that I wanted to see, or I think like somebody should write a book on, is that all of these people in the army, um, uh, people who the leftists, and sort of our diaspora. So there is a global angle to all of these things, right? So, I mean,
yeah,
so it's 1971. I mean, of course, they didn't have social media and they didn't have, Spotify, but they, sort of Dhaka was still, it was much smaller, but people in Dhaka were still tuned to the broader outside world, and in that sense, sort of 71 was actually a global thing. So I mean, we forget, but the first rock concert for eight concert was the concert for
yeah,
Bangladesh,
sure.
right? So sort of
We
so
were the OGs, absolutely.
we would know OJs, absolutely, right? Sort of this is something that I sort of mentioned in this article, but did not actually expand on it because it didn't happen then. But somebody pointed it out to me in a personal conversation. Nail Rahman actually, that sort of in July 24, remittance boycott played a huge role, right? And this is something I know because. Sort of back then, sort of this was something that we were monitoring very closely, and now we know that the Hasina regime was also monitoring this very closely. That remittance boycott actually did have a significant impact if Hasina had not fled on the 5th, within the next few days, Bangladesh would have probably defaulted because of the impact, right?
Yeah.
What we don't appreciate is that same thing played out. Same thing was playing out in 1971 at a much slower pace,
Yeah.
because sort of in 2024, cash transfer is much easier, and the dollar needs are much bigger. In 1971, Pakistan was a much smaller economy. Is Pakistan
Yeah.
even more so, right? But the same economics still held, that Pakistan still needed to pay its bills. Sort of the balance of payments accountings were still what they were, and we had a large diaspora in UK, the Bengali diaspora, East Bengali diaspora in UK, that remitted money, pounds, which
Yeah.
paid for Pakistan's balance of payments. And
Yeah.
there were activism in London,
Yeah.
and by sort of younger people, or sort of professionals, and sort of the working folks, our immigrants, our expats, right? And one of the things that they started doing was actually what now we call remittance boycott, right?
Yeah.
They
Yeah.
were saying that, like, look, let's not send this money back, or even if we do, let's not send it back through the formal channels through Pakistan. Let's
Yeah.
send the money through refugees in India, and or send the money to Mujibnagar, to
Yeah.
Kolkata, and allow them to, because we want to look after our families. We don't want to pay for the Pakistani war machine, right?
Yeah.
And there was a World Bank team that was visiting, IMF World Bank team that was visiting Pakistan, East Pakistan, visiting Pakistan, and then visited Dhaka on a fact-finding mission in the middle, sort of in the monsoon months of 71, right? And there was a famous Mukti Bahini attack in Hotel Intercontinental, right?
Yeah.
What we now would call terrorism in modern parlance,
Sure.
or urban guerrilla warfare. But basically, the idea here was to show these IMF World Bank, these Washington people, that
That the writ of Islamabad does not run
does not
in
run.
East Pakistan
Exactly.
in Bangladesh. Yeah.
That's right. That there is actually a war, and that, you shouldn't lend money to this government, because this is money you are not going to be able to get back. Right.
Yeah.
So there were all these global connections, right? So Raghavan's book is called A Global History, which I
Mm.
think is a misnomer, because
Yeah.
what he does is he shows that, okay, these are the various sort of power plays that was going on between Indian foreign policy calculations, and sort of they tried to reach out to the Soviets. They were worried about the Chinese and all of those things. So sort of this kind of Cold War politics, which is fine, which is interesting. But to me,
Yeah.
the global history or the global angle of 71 would cover these kind of things that, sort of tell us about how Ravi Shankar went and got George Harrison to sign up for a concert that that, by the way, George Harrison had to pay for, sort of himself, because the
Yeah.
story is that even though a lot of money was raised because of all the you see, they didn't have the, nobody had done something like this before, so nobody knew that how this money would flow, sort of the royalties, and sort of the record companies, and the sort of legal apparatus was not there, right?
Yeah.
So they did the concert in August. Money was raised, but the money could not actually come to the refugees, because sort of they couldn't figure out how to do it. So
Yeah, no, the
Harrison
logistic. I
wrote a
mean,
check.
back in 1971, the logistical challenges of moving money and aid were far more pronounced than they are in today's world. We have an
Absolutely.
entire we
Yeah,
have an entire global aid infrastructure in place. Nothing
that's
like this
right.
existed then. Yeah.
Yeah, and then sort of interesting you mentioned that, because the other thing that came out of the war, right? So Sir Fazle Hassan Abed's BRAC,
Yeah.
or Dr. Zafrullah Chaudhury's Ganashastro,
Yeah.
and even sort of the ideas that led to Professor Yunus's Grameen and the whole NGO sort of complex, all of these things actually, so sort of there's a reason why Bangladesh was the the what Naomi Hussein calls the aid laboratory. The reason for all of that is because all of these individuals participated in various diaspora efforts or war effort, the
Yeah.
liberation movement effort, and then they came home and they saw that, okay, the state didn't exist here, and
Yeah.
we need to do all of these things. We cannot rely on the traditional government channel, right?
Yeah.
So sort of there is goodwill and aid from the West or from abroad, and there's work that needs to be done,
Yeah.
and our state is dysfunctional, our politics is not going to fix itself. So all of these things, there's a global element, the whole, yeah, like sort of humanitarian aid complex or NGO complex, or all of these things. Well, like sort of it started um during 71, right? So there
Yeah.
is that history that needs to be written.
Yeah.
So and like sort of these books didn't cover that, but I wish somebody would.
You say how 1971 in Bangladesh created the modern world. That's a great story.
Absolutely, right. Yes, yes. Yeah. So
No,
yeah,
it's
so that was
interesting. I
the other
just
thing.
edited a piece a young man has written, which I'm going to be publishing later today. It's a very good piece, and I thought I want to foreground young people's voices. Okay,
Absolutely.
in Counterpoint, especially talking about 1971, I thought it
By
was going to
young
be a
people, do
nice.
you mean this in a Bangladeshi young people where, like, people like us are also considered young,
No, no,
or
I think
genuinely young
I
people?
don't know because I don't know this young man, but I think he's perhaps in his 20s. So I think by any criteria that counts as young.
That counts as young. Yeah.
But
Okay.
I don't know actually because I don't know who he is. But I've
Okay.
got his what's the word? I have his bio. What does it say? It's he's a founder and president of Dhaka Thinks, a youth-led think tank in Bangladesh. His name's
Okay.
Arman Ahmed.
Okay.
Okay, so now of course this is a this is a self-penned bio. So youth-led think tank may mean something different to him, but I am taking him at his face value that he is indeed a youth, or at least under the age of 30. Anyway, the reason I brought this up is I did edit out with this one piece. I think it's a very good piece, but at one point he talks about 1971 is one of the most important moments in human history. So I thought, well, that's over egging the brulee a little. I thought it
Okay.
is certainly very important, But and like I said, while I wouldn't say it is one of the seminal events in world history, I do think, getting back to the point we just made, that it is an underreported story that how influential it has been in creating this world in which we live, geopolitically and also in terms of global aid and all of that.
Yeah, and then the other point that I made in the article, or the essay, was that there is this tendency, and like sort of Bass goes on to this in great detail, but also Raghavan, that, okay, look, sort of the US role, that, like, maybe Nixon should have heavied in on Yahya, because that would have stopped the bloodshed. Or the
Sure.
other way around is that, look, sort of Henry Kissinger is a, sort of he was egging Yahya on because he wanted his, sort of his passage to China, right? And sort of there is in the books there's also this, sort of that Kissinger visited India, then he visited Pakistan, and then he
Well,
claimed that
I've
he
read
had tummy
someplace.
upset.
I'm not sure where I read this. Whether it's in cables or conversations where Kissinger's trying to argue that oh well and it's there's a certain amount of revisionist history saying that if the Bangladeshi just held their horses, we would have been able to have come up with a negotiated settlement which would have sorted
Sure.
out all of their problems. It just would have taken a little bit of time. If they'd given us
Yeah,
another 6 months or a year, we'd have
that's right.
managed it all. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah. So he claims that basically that, look, sort of we just couldn't do it in 71 because we were trying to go to China, and once
Yeah.
that deal was done, once sort of the next thing would have been
Yeah.
this, and we would
Yeah.
have given Bengalis, Bangladesh, its freedom. But it's just basically
Yeah.
that
That
India
does
will give
sound.
way, and
Pardon me for not
not buying that, right? Yeah,
buying that particular
yeah, yeah.
narrative. Yeah.
Yeah,
There's a
but the
certain
but
amount
the,
of
the
revisionism
but
there.
the underlying assumption in all of these things is that Americans could do things and they didn't, right?
Yeah.
And you see this even now, that sort of the narrative in Dhaka, right, and not just from the people who were with the Army League, and they see that, like, Hasina was overthrown by some, deep conspiracy by the Americans, and Yunus is a
Yeah.
ploy of that. But even among people who were supposedly on the July side and, has welcomed the fall of Hasina, even they would say, oh, well, of course, the Americans were involved. I mean, like, do you think that it's just by accident that, and, like, there is all this thing that, like, sort of Americans can do a lot of things, and I question that, right? I mean,
Yeah.
sort of,
Sure.
yeah. So, sort of, okay, if we take this seriously, that, like, Americans were actually involved or would have done something, who were they involved with, and how come, I mean, sort of, so, sort of, somebody should actually explore that as well, right? And
No, I
so,
mean,
for
I think
example,
in point of fact, I mean, 1971 tells the story of American impotence on the global stage.
right?
It showed what their limitations were. It
Yeah,
showed what they were able to do and what they were not able to do.
that's right.
Certainly, they could have maybe played a role in restraining the Yahya in the Pakistan army, which they did not do, and that's something we can fault them for. And certainly, they gave all of the diplomatic cover and otherwise that Pakistan needed. Okay, but at
Sure,
the same time, at the end of the day, they did draw certain lines, and this was a massive diplomatic defeat for them in the
that's
final
right.
analysis.
Exactly.
There's a
That,
marvelous picture. I don't know if you've seen it, of George Bush at the UN, because he was the US's ambassador to the UN, and he's sitting there like this
his head down.
with his
Exactly.
head down. And it's just this classic picture. Yeah,
Yes, and that is yet another interesting point that is actually, sort of not often appreciated in Bangladesh, is that he was doing that when Bhutto,
yeah,
Zulfi Bhutto, was doing his famous theatrics
yeah,
in UN Security Council, where, he was basically saying that, like, I shall go back and fight for
yeah,
my country. I shall fight for 1,000 years,
yeah,
and here is your Security Council resolution. So he
yeah,
tears this thing up,
yeah,
dramatically walks out.
yeah.
Except the resolution that he tore up in December
On the 15th.
71,
Yeah,
December 50, is, yeah, that, like, sort of, so here the Indian army is in the outskirts of Dhaka. So they are now, sort of in Savar and Joydepur, right? And the resolution says that immediate ceasefire and complete demilitarization of East Pakistan, which means not just withdrawal of Pakistani forces, but also Indian forces, 12
yeah.
months of UN rule, followed by a fresh election, and then a new government. So this is basically as close to a face-saving solution that Pakistan could possibly have.
But
But
clearly, at this
also,
stage,
it would have
Bhutto.
denied India and
Yeah,
Army League coming to
uh,
power, right? Like,
sure.
Mujibnagar government would not have been able to come to power. Mujib would not have been able to come to power because the resolution called for 12 months of
Yeah,
UN
yeah.
rule.
Yeah. No,
Who
so
knows
clearly
what would
he
have
was, of course, he was now at this point thinking of his own political future.
happened. Right. Yeah. So
Yeah, no.
yeah, basically that, like, sort of, so the point, the overall point that I was making in the essay, and I'm not looking at time, we should probably draw this to a close because
Sure, no, no. I
you
have
know
a few more points I would do want to raise, but I think we're good. We're good.
Sure.
Yeah, carry on.
Yeah, yeah, but the point I wanted to make is that, okay, look, sort of, there is a lot of things that are unexplored
Yeah,
and that you could do serious history with, because there are archival records. So the other thing I was making was that a lot of the Bangla books,
yeah,
and for that matter, Pakistani books, are
yeah,
memoirs, right?
yeah.
Here is what I did, here is what I saw, and so on, right? Okay, so now there is some human element to that is true, that's useful, and that's emotive, and so on. So I mean, like, the title of the essay was Ekatturer Boiguli. Of course, the iconic Bangla book is Ekatturer Dinguli by late Jahanara Imam,
Yeah.
um, right? But, sort of, serious history is not memoir, because, memories can be funny. We tend to tend to remember things that matter to us. I'm not saying that anybody is making anything up,
Yeah.
but,
No, but there is a different.
we
It is a.
remember
It's
things
a
for
different kind of
replaying.
a. It's a
Yeah,
different kind of a narrative. It's a different kind of a story.
yeah,
No, you're right. Let me just, since we are coming into the last 10 minutes, there are a couple of things I did want to bring up. Let's talk a little bit about the notion of inevitability. And in fact, like I said, now we tend to think back and we figure that one way or another, independence was inevitable, and we were bound to win. But But let's talk about how that was not necessarily the case. Again, yesterday, I spoke with my father, and he was saying that when he fled in March 27, because the Pakistani army was going to come to arrest him, and and crossed over the border, and he had no idea when he would be back. He had no idea if he would be back, and he had no idea whether we would ever win, because there was no thought at that point that victory was by any means inevitable. And in fact, I mean, it was the resistance which was put up initially by the army, who the people such as Zia Rahman, people such as Khalid Musharraf, Shafiullah, who had Tahir, that was in a sense, not in the impact was not something which people knew about so much then or anticipated.
No, that's right. I mean, so again, so what happened here was that whole bunch of mid-level officers in a conventional army, right? So Pakistan army was a conventional army created by the Raj, right? So this is not an army. So Pakistan army itself did not grow out of battle. Like it did not grow out of
True, absolutely.
liberation
It
war
was
or
part of
anything.
the British Indian Army. So
British Indian
and for
army.
what that means, yeah, we must understand that. Yeah.
That's right. So it's sort of this is where you are trained to follow orders. You are not supposed to ask. Ours is to
Yeah.
ours is to do or die, not to ask why.
As not to reason why. Exactly.
Ours is
Yeah.
not to reason why, right?
Yeah.
So Pakistani generals probably did not. In fact, sort of they wrote it in their books and memoirs that we could not countenance that sort of battalions would just rise up in revolt. Right? This is something that would I'm like how would that happen? Why would So that's one thing. So this was not inevitable. This was a shock, right?
Yeah.
But the other thing, now there is a lot of debate about whether the brutality was something that sort of that was planned or sort of it happened. So that is something that probably there is a literature on. I think that the brutality is undeniable.
Yeah.
That is well established in the literature, right? That the attempted genocide, use of rape as a political weapon, ethnic cleansing, or at least cleansing of Hindu Bengalis out of East Bengal. So these are well documented. There is not really, I mean, sort of people who argue against that are doing politics. They're not doing history, right?
Yeah.
Okay. But the question is that whether this was premeditated, right? And I think sort of that probably needs to be explored. One effect of that is that it created India with a situation where it could not but get involved, right? Because so one thing that Raghavan does really well in his book is he documents the debates that took place in New Delhi about what to do, right?
Yeah.
That and by the way, this also probably has resonance now, given that they again have Awami League leaders under very different circumstances, obviously, but sort of sitting there, right? So okay, so you had these politicians that are coming into your border, fleeing your neighbor. You have these rebel soldiers, right? That with their weapons are coming over across the border. You have people like Professor Sobhan and others, political activists and economists and sort of bureaucrats crossing over the border, and then you've got 8 to 10 million refugees, most of whom are Hindu.
Yeah.
In the backdrop of partition, what do you do, right? Do you accept that international borders are what they are, and because if you don't accept that, and if you give support to this freedom struggle, this this liberation movement, what is to stop somebody else from giving support to your separation?
Well, my understanding is that one of the key considerations for the Indian government was, and especially in the later stages of the war, before they took a more active role, was that serious concern that the left elements in Bangladesh would link up with the left elements in West Bengal, because of course you have to understand at this point West Bengal was facing a proto-insurgency, what now today we would call a terrorist insurgency, but in those days,
yeah. Exactly. So yeah, so India had all of
And
these
they were
conflicts.
very concerned.
They
They
were very
certainly
concerned.
didn't want an independent Bangladesh ruled by uh, a revolutionary government, a revolutionary leftist force. That was the
Right.
last thing they wanted. Though, interestingly enough, again, this conversation I had with my father, he maintains that that of course, and this is of course historical fact, is that the war, the Indo-Pakistan, the final stage of the liberation war from December 3rd to the 16th, was in fact kicked off by the Pakistanis of all people. They were the ones
That's right.
who tried a
Yeah.
preemptive bombing strike
Yeah.
on the Indian airfields. But his theory on this is that by that time, by the time December rolled around, their eventual loss was very apparent. And the reason they did this is they then wanted to then draw India into the conflict and make it seem, their last roll of the dice was make it seem as though this is Indian aggression, and that, if they were going to lose, they were going to lose to India. And of course, this was the entire tenor of the conversation at the United Nations in the month of December, that this is Indian aggression rather than them coming to the rescue of a beleaguered peoples, and they did not want to surrender to the Mukti Bahini.
No, true. But no, absolutely. And so just seeing the whole thing from the Pakistani side now, right? And also that, like, sort of there were many in India, as Raghavan actually documents, that basically advised. And then going back to your question about inevitability, right?
Yeah,
There was not, it was not even inevitable that India would support a liberation movement. It would militarily intervene and install the Awami League government and so on, for the fear of the left. The other thing they could have done, and they actually seriously contemplated, was that, okay, we take in these 8 million Hindus or 10 million Hindus as unfinished business of partition, right?
yeah,
um, and the reason they didn't do that, one big reason that they didn't do that, is that it would have led to a anti-Muslim backlash in India, which would have changed the secular politics of or secular nature of Indian Republic. I mean, like, today we know that India has had a massive Hindutva turn and all of that, but back in the 70s, this was not the case. India
this is
prided
Indira
itself.
Gandhi's India. That's right.
It was Indira Gandhi's India. It was Nehru's India. It prided itself for being a secular country. So, sort of they had this discussion that, okay, well, look, in 47, there were ethnic cleansing in Punjab. And, well, okay, there were trains full of dead bodies, and from both sides, we have been through this. Why not take in 10 million Hindu Bengalis and be done with that, and let Pakistan sort itself out, whether they have a military government or, whatever, it's their problem, right? But they couldn't
Yeah.
do that because they thought that, okay, if we did this, then there would be a backlash, and then we would lose 5 million of our Muslims, and this is something we cannot allow, right?
No, not just that. Then, of course, they would then have a permanently the character of in this scenario, the character of East Pakistan would permanently change. The character of Pakistan would permanently change.
Permanently change, exactly.
You see,
and
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 would,
that
yeah,
that brings me to the other point, and I did not write it in this article, but I had been thinking about this a lot, given the surge of Jamaat in post Hasina Bangladesh. And that like, sort of, how would the world look like from Jamaat's perspective in 1971 when the war began, right? They would not have expected Pakistan army to lose.
yeah,
I
sure,
mean, Pakistan army would not have expected it to lose.
yeah,
And so, sort of independent of any ideological, views about whether, sort of they were doing they were standing by. I mean, like, there were a lot of people who believed in Pakistan as the homeland of Indian Muslims and were dismayed that Jinda's Pakistan was breaking up. But not all of them actually, sort of joined as collaborators of the occupation forces. Not all of them joined the Al Badr and all of these things, right? And sort of poignant in the sense of sort of just 2 days after 14th December, right? Not all of them committed those kind of things. There were many people who were pro-Pakistan, who were upset that sort of the Pakistan of their dream was ending, and still fell well short of not joining the occupation forces, not being collaborators.
yeah,
But Jamaat didn't, right? And Well, sort of maybe their real politic calculation was that, okay, someday this war would end, most likely in a victory by Pakistan, and
Yeah.
then there would be politics, right? So
Yeah.
Army League would be finished,
Yeah.
there would be a vacuum, and we would reap the benefit. We would be the largest party, or if not the largest party, one of the largest parties. Maybe it would be
Yeah.
left and us, right? And again, like, when you think about what has happened since the fall of Hasina in August, July uprising, and we see the surge of Jamaat, the whole 1971 scenario kind of I'm like, sort of seeing 1971 from this prism and seeing it through the lens of Jamaat surge, it kind of makes sense that why they actually actively signed up for Pakistan and collaborated against Bangladesh
Well,
war.
I actually will tell you in this. We have a narrative in Bangladesh that the entire country was united, against Pakistan. But I don't actually think that's true. And it's not just that the Jamaat were a small outlier. I mean, I think there were many people who really kind of sat on the fence for a number of reasons. You know. Some perhaps thought that that what would follow would be perhaps not a positive thing. Some people just wanted a quiet life. Some people wanted undivided Pakistan. And many people probably figured that at the end of the day, like it almost always happens in movements such as this, that the state would prevail. And so
Yeah,
they wanted to be on what they thought was the right side of history, turned out to be the wrong side of history. And so there are
that's
all of
right.
these calculations at play. But all of this, again, getting back to where we started, I feel all of these nuanced discussions have been something which we haven't really had as a nation, not just the last 15 years, but the last 50. And as we sign off today, I'm hopeful that this conversation we have here can be the first of many, not just between the two of us, but in general. I think this is a conversation Bangladesh needs to have, Bangladeshis need to have with itself, with ourselves. And I think only good can come of opening up this space for discussion. So thank you for doing this. I really appreciated that article you wrote, and I think the people who read it have appreciated it as well. There's so much in it that we haven't had time to touch on in today's discussion. So many books we actually haven't really focused on. I'm thinking of Noenika Mukherjee's book, for instance. I'm thinking of Aman Zakaria's book. And you even mentioned one book which I haven't actually myself read, but I'm now going to put it on my list. It is Tazeen Murshid's book. And these
Absolutely.
sound very, very interesting. We haven't even had the
Well,
space to discuss them here.
that's right.
But
Yes.
maybe we can do a follow-up at some point where we
Yeah.
continue to talk about this, maybe bring in other people to the discussion, where
Maybe
we
we can
really start
actually bring
having this
Tazeen Appa
discussion.
herself and ask her
Yeah.
that, like, hey, like,
I'd
tell
love
us
that,
about your book,
because
so
these are the conversations we ought to be having. And as I said, if Bangladesh 2.0 means anything at all, it means creating the space for this kind of conversation. So thank you very much, Jyoti. Thank you for those of you who are watching, tuning in at what I know for Bangladeshis is an unearthly hour. Nothing in Bangladesh ever really gets done before noon. And of course, this is going to be available on Counterpoint's YouTube channel. It's going to be available on Counterpoint's Facebook page. So those of you who have not been able to tune in live can certainly see this in the coming days and weeks. Thank you very much.
thank you. All right. Bye. Okay.
I think we're still live.
We are still live. I'm trying to
Okay,
stop.
so we have to make sure not to scratch